Welcome back to Learning with Mrs. Preby. We are in A New Nation, Lesson 11. Today's story is called Liberty and Justice for All. So I noticed this question mark at the end of this. This is a very important concept for today because this is not a statement. It is asking. It is asking the question, liberty and justice for all? Okay. Today's learning goal is I can describe the connection between women, Native Americans, and slaves and the way they were treated at the time of the Revolutionary War. It's an important concept because when we think about who we have been learning about, mostly these are American men, okay? There also happen to be all the same skin tones. Nobody has any dark skin tones in this picture. And we learned about George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. And then we also learned about, this is another picture of, again, George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. So these are all Euro Americans, Caucasian people, men. Today you're going to learn more about others who were living in America at the same time. There were women, African Americans, and Native Americans. In today's read aloud, well, in this unit, you've heard a lot of big words in this domain. And in today's read aloud, you're going to hear more words that might be unfamiliar to you. Two of these words are very important to understanding today's story, understanding the story of our country or nation, the United States. Liberty and justice. Liberty means freedom, and that the war against Great Britain was fought so Americans could be free citizens, able to make their own laws. Say the word liberty, okay? Liberty means freedom. Justice means treating others fairly. And that the war was fought in part to ensure that the laws they made were fair for everyone. So say the word justice. Justice means fairness. Liberty and justice are the same as freedom and fairness. Keep those two words, liberty and justice, in mind as you listen to the read aloud. And think about these three groups, women, African Americans, and Native Americans. And I want you to decide whether these people were given liberty and justice, freedom and fairness when the United States was a new country. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Where have you heard those words before? Listen again to see if you can remember who wrote these words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created equal, and that they were endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Who was it that wrote these important words? Here's a hint. He was a founding father and a wonderful writer, and he lived at Monticello, and he became the third president. Of course, you said. Thomas Jefferson wrote them as part of our Declaration of Independence. Remember how the founding fathers felt that they were being treated unfairly by the British? They did not feel that they were being treated equally or the same as the British on the other side of the ocean, or the British who actually lived in the country of Great Britain. The colonists wanted liberty or freedom from the rules of the British. What were the British doing that Americans felt were so unfair? If you remember, there was taxation without representation. So they didn't have any rights to make any rules. And they were being taxed, right? The colonists wanted liberty or freedom from the rules of Britain, from the rules of the British. And so when Jefferson sat down to write these famous words, he wanted to make sure that the new American nation would treat its people fairly. So there's the Continental Congress. Again, when the founders meant to write our Constitution of the United States, they wrote about liberty and justice. When we hold our hands over our hearts and we pledge allegiance to our country today, our final words are, with liberty and justice for all. These were important words written by our founders, but not all people were treated fairly in the American colonies. Can you think of anyone who was not being treated fairly with justice in the American colonies? Let's look back at the 1700s, during and after the war, when the founders were busy writing these important words. Whom did they mean by we when they wrote the Constitution? We, the people of the United States. Some people say they must have been thinking about themselves, a group of white men who made the laws of the land. When were they forgetting the other people on the continent, Native Americans who had lived there the longest? Women and African American slaves? These were very smart men writing words that they knew would be read and reread by others for many years to come. They were writing for the future. Nevertheless, it is true that not everyone in these colonial times was treated equally. And even today, people are still seeking liberty and justice for all. During the Revolutionary War, women had different roles than they have today. Although today many women serve in our military and help protect us by fighting in wars, this wasn't the case during the Revolutionary War. Some women wanted to be soldiers, but they were not allowed to join the army. Why do you think they weren't allowed to fight? Do you think that was fair? We know that some women actually disguised themselves by dressing up like men so they could fight alongside of them. Right here, this woman right here, dressed up like a man. One of the most famous of these women was Deborah Sampson, who fought in the war under the name Robert Sherlock. Women were not allowed to vote. In fact, all women did not receive the right to vote in America until 150 years after the Constitution was written. Remember, one reason the war was fought was because the colonists felt it was unfair that they could not vote in the British Parliament. And yet women were not able to vote in their own land. Do you think that was fair? Was that liberty and justice for all? There were many people from Africa who were brought to America as slaves for the colonists. When the colonists decided to fight for their freedom from Great Britain, they themselves were keeping freedom from a large number of African slaves, because the slaves did not have freedom to choose how to live their lives. Slavery was especially common in the South, where huge plantations had large amounts of land to farm, and colonists depended on the work of these slaves. Can you imagine how difficult it was to harvest or to pick crops like cotton, shown in this image, before there were machines to do it? Can you imagine how hard that labor was? In the New England and the Middle States, slavery started to disappear after the Revolutionary War, but continued for a long time in the South, where these large farms were located. Slaves were also not allowed to vote. Was that liberty and justice for all? For a long time, Native Americans lived on North America continent alone. Yet life for them began changing when the first European explorers arrived hundreds of years before the Revolutionary War. You will remember that some of them chose to help the colonists and trade with them when they first arrived. However, it wasn't long before the colonists started exploring lands to the west, pushing Native Americans off their land. Native Americans were also not allowed to vote. Was that liberty and justice for all? So, what do you think? Was the decisions of our nation's founders to fight a 6-year war for independence a wise decision? It probably was. The government they set up 200 years ago has served as a model for the rest of the world ever since. It was certainly not fair to all people in the early years, and there was still many ways in which it can be improved. But it's up to us, we the people, to make each day better for all of us. After all, liberty and justice have a lot to do with how we treat one another every day. What are the two big words that you were listening for in the read aloud? Liberty and justice. The Declaration of Independence of the new nation states that all men are created equal. What groups of people did you heard about that were not given certain rights at the time the Declaration was written? Women, African American slaves, and Native Americans. If a woman wanted to fight in a battle, what did she have to do? She had to dress in a disguise. And what ways were women not given liberty of justice? They were not able to fight for their country, and they were not able to vote. In what ways were African American slaves not given liberty or justice? They didn't have any freedoms. They were not allowed to vote. In what ways were Native Americans not given liberty or justice? They were pushed off their lands, and they were not allowed to vote. In today's read aloud, you heard the founders did not feel like they were being treated equally or the same as the British on the other side of the ocean. Say the word equally with me. Equally means treating someone exactly the same as another, or dividing something into parts that are the same size or amount. I divided a pie equally among all the people at the table. Tell about how you or others treat people equally, or how you may have divided something equally among friends. So try to remember to use the word equally and a complete sentence. Go ahead and pause the video and talk about it now. Did you pause? Did you pause the video? What were we talking about? Oh, right, equally. I'm going to name a couple groups of people, and if you think they're treated equally, say they're treated equally. If you don't think that they're treated the same, say they're not treated equally. So, for example, parents and children. I'm not sure how you felt, but they're not really treated equally because parents have to be the boss, right? They have to tell you when to go to bed. You don't get to tell them when to go to bed. So maybe you had a different thought, though. Boys and girls. Boys and girls are pretty much treated equally in my house. I wonder if they are in yours. Thank you for joining me today. Today's learning goal was I can describe the connection between women, Native Americans, and slaves, and the way they were treated at the time of the Revolutionary War. There was a lot of injustice, and there was a lot of unfairness with liberty. Not everybody had liberty. We have to work every day to change this. Thank you for joining me. Until tomorrow, have a great day.